There's a fight inside all of us, a purpose that binds us together. We are all Aggies, and together, nothing can stand in our way. We are fearless on every front.
Hello there. Good. Howdy, folks. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Again, taking time off on a Saturday where you guys could be watching football or just kind of hanging out somewhere else, and you guys are here, so we appreciate it. On behalf of the Texas Tribune, we welcome you to the 8th Annual Texas Tribune Festival. We're very, very happy to be here, and we're very honored to have three experts in the field that are going to lend their expertise on a very important issue that affects not only diplomatic relations, but our pocketbook, or what we spend on every single day. So just a couple housekeeping items. I was asked to tell you all that this panel is being supported by Texas A&M University, which last I checked, I think they were still beating Arkansas in the football game. So that's, for all you Aggies out there, that's good news. And obviously, just because we have sponsors, that does not mean that they influence our content whatsoever. I've also been asked to let you all know that the panel is going to be about 40-45 minutes, me moderating, asking these three gentlemen questions about trade and NAFTA and where we are with negotiations. The last 15 minutes, we'll open it up to questions from you folks. I'll let you all know when to get lined up, and we ask that everybody is very respectful, very polite. We don't want speeches, we just want a question, just that way we give everybody time to have a turn. No booing or hissing or protesting, that's what Twitter is for. We'll just save it for that. And then also, I've also been asked to tell you all that after this, there's a meet and greet that's being hosted by H&K Strategies, if you guys want to have a little chit-chat with our panel members. One note is that former Ambassador Ron Cook could not be here, but Ambassador Tony Garza was kind enough to, as he said, pinch hit for us, but it's, he's not, just somebody that doesn't, you said, hey, are you available? He's obviously very, very knowledgeable about this issue. He still resides in Mexico City, so he's one of the three experts. So without further ado, I'd just like to ask you to give these gentlemen a round of applause for taking their time out. And I will start with some brief introductions and we'll get to it. Like I said, a former Ambassador Tony Garza, he served as the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico from 2002 to 2009. He's currently counsel to White case in Mexico City and serves as trustee to SMU. He's the past president of UT Austin's Alumni Association, Hookham. And he also served as chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission and as a Secretary of State. So he's not only knowledgeable about Mexican politics, but about what goes on in the great state of Texas. Mr. Martin, he is a global chairman and CEO of Hill Knowlton Strategies. He's served in that capacity since 2011. He founded Public Strategies Incorporated, a communications consulting firm. And he has managed the communications, government affairs, and investor relations strategy for several large corporations for more than 2 decades. And last but not least, Chairman Anchia, he is a Democrat from Dallas. He's represented House District 103 since 2005. He is the chairman of the House International Trade Intergovernmental Affairs Committee. Excuse me. He also sits on the Pensions Committee, Select Committee on State and Federal Power and Responsibility. Again, so very knowledgeable gentlemen here, and let's get started. So I wanted to come out swinging because this is, trade wins, that's the name of the panel, but it might as well be, winds of change, because you never know from one week to the next what's going on with the administration. So I wanted to obviously bring us up to speed on what is going on with negotiations with Mexico first. Mexico currently is our #3 trading partner behind China and Canada, but that's only a difference of $15–20 billion, and that sounds like a lot, but when you consider the fact that there's $1 billion a day in two-way trade between the three countries, I kind of say it's like lap 2 and 3, right, at a race car. Depending on who gets the edge on one's going to be in the lead, and then a week later somebody else is going to be in the lead. So, with respect to Mexico, which is very important to Texas, I want to ask the panelists, where are we currently? What do we know with respect to what's going on, and what do we expect in the coming days?
Want to take that one, Ambassador?
Well, I'll try. And first, Julian, thank you. If I kind of speak in a bit of a shorthand, it's because I generally think that folks that show up at these panels show up because they're pretty interested in the subject and they have some background. And so I'll kind of tell you where I think we are. If you looked at the arc of the negotiation throughout when the U.S., Mexico, and Canada were all at the table, you realize that Mexico early on in that process had gone from being the piñata at the party of the Trump campaign to the object of sort of ire and criticism to by the time they reached the U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, a very important tactical ally in trying to create urgency in the process. And I think at the announcement of the U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, a couple of things became pretty clear to folks that looked at that agreement closely. One is that there had been some modifications to the U.S.-Mexico agreement, if you will, that there was an attempt to clear the underbrush in terms of some of the more conflictive issues on that relationship. But outside of a couple of areas, rules of origin as it relates to manufacturing, which is a big issue for the Trump administration as it hit on deficits, and perhaps the sunset clause, there really hadn't been a lot of change to the agreement. There'd been some modernization on things that had not been part of the agreement earlier.
Could you define briefly the rules of origin for, I'm assuming most of the people
Well,
here know,
rules of
but
origin define where the content in a manufactured product has to have come from to qualify for NAFTA treatment.
Okay.
Okay? And the administration had taken the position that because we had about a $60 or $65 billion deficit with Mexico on those particular items, that was unacceptable. Forget that's not really the way you should evaluate an agreement. You look at the entire context of the agreement and the overall impact. But at the end of that process, in the U.S.-Mexico agreement, you had something, but what you really had was an ability to turn to Canada and say, they've got their agreement, you get yours, we have a looming deadline. So I think tactically, it made a lot of sense because it created urgency. You can't imagine that when they announced that there was celebration in Ottawa. Canada felt they'd been thrown under the bus. I've used the expression, they weren't thrown under it, but the bus drove by real quick and they were told jump on it. And that's essentially where we are as it relates to Canada. My position, and I'll try to wind this up because really we can go on with this, is that you really don't have the kind of trade agreement that makes the most sense for North America without Canada being part of it. After 25 years, you've had a certain level of integration of the supply chains, the way cross-border business functions, the investments that really make the North American platform a very competitive one and one that is very much in the interest of the three countries. And when you start backing out one country or the other after that level of integration, you really create some challenges in terms of maintaining that competitiveness. So now you have Canada trying to get to a finish line by sometime this weekend with their elections in Ottawa out there in October. And so you have this period where Mexico would like to get this done, so this agreement with the U.S. can be signed before their next president or the president-elect takes office on December 1st. Canada would like not to have this happen before their elections in October. The president in the U.S. has sort of kind of created a great deal of uncertainty, and I think it's unlikely that they'll get to a Congress this cycle. So you've got to ask yourself, will a new Congress in January, likely of the other party, want to give this administration a trade victory, what is essentially the first day of the next presidential cycle in the U.S.? And you have to say there was, I think, a miscalculation as to the political timetables that would have to be managed, largely because we have a tendency in the United States, while we promote democracy, we don't seem to factor in the fact that other countries have elections too, and that they have some political sort of exigencies that they have to deal with. So at the end of the process, I think where we are is there's still a great deal of uncertainty. You could probably get to a finish line if there was a lot more resolve. I don't see us getting there now. Likely next year. If nobody withdraws from the agreement, we'll have had 2 years of circus and essentially status quo. And I think the unfortunate byproduct of that is you'll have status quo and you'll have squandered a great deal of goodwill that had been built up over 25 years between the countries. So, anyway, sure. I know that was probably too much.
Chairman, you want?
You know, I'm grateful, Julian, for you having me here on the panel with our terrific panelists. I've known these two gentlemen for a long time. If I can just add a little bit more context to what the ambassador was discussing, and really talk about process. Trade Promotion Authority is something that the U.S. Congress derogates to the executive branch so that the executive branch can go out and negotiate trade agreements. This is something that we colloquially know as fast track. Trade Promotion Authority that was granted by the U.S. Congress to the President includes the concept of a three-party agreement as a renegotiation of NAFTA. It is not a bilateral agreement, it is a three-party agreement. That derogation of authority really undermines the President's ability to only try to get a bilateral done, because members of both parties in Congress have said, hey, no, when we said NAFTA, we said 3 countries, all of North America, not just U.S., Mexico. So we shall see if this negotiating exigency that the President has tried to instill as a result of the bilateral agreement that has been struck with Mexico, if that bluff will be called by Canada. And I think the ambassador has alluded to that. But the timeline is as follows. Under the Trade Promotion Authority, you give notice to Congress. The President gave notice to Congress on August 31st, right? Trade Promotion Authority requires that 30 days after that, text is released. So we're expecting text on the bilateral agreement with Canada to hit tonight or tomorrow, effectively. Now, we know how deadlines go, but we should see some text about what is negotiated. People, and you've probably read it in the popular press, that a bilateral deal had been struck. But keep in mind, that was just a statement, a broad-based statement of principles, and there was really very little detail to it. And I think when you interviewed me after those principles had been agreed to, sure. I said, hey, the devil is always in the details, course, right? Always. And so that August 31st notification kicked off the 30-day timeline for text, and then a 90-day timeline all in for negotiation of the agreement. Already you have Senator Cornyn here in Texas saying, look, Canada's got to be part of the deal. Huge missed opportunity.
Governor Abbott as well.
And Governor Abbott has. The chairman of the International Trade and Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, a very important thought leader on this. No, that's not true. That's me. Has also weighed in saying we need a three-country agreement. But the reality is, and Julian gave you trade data, U.S. trade data, right? But for Texas, Mexico is our #1 trading partner by a long shot, in fact. And then number 2 and 3 are vied for by Canada and China. Right. Sometimes, so depending on when you're measuring in the year, China will be up or Canada will be up, right. But it's roughly the next 2. And that doesn't include, that bilateral trade does not include foreign investment. In Texas, there are 700 Canadian companies that do business here, that have engaged in foreign direct investment in Texas to establish operations. So we're talking about, as the ambassador said earlier, a really integrated trilateral relationship. And for people who are saying, well, this is just negotiating tactics, we're already starting to see some evidence that markets are reacting to this uncertainty. We know that companies that do business in the three countries have hit the pause button, waiting to see some predictability about what our trade policy was going to look like. They had already been moving chess pieces on the board in anticipation of a Trans-Pacific partnership. All right, so that's been paused, and now this uncertainty with NAFTA has also paused a lot of investment that companies who are sitting on a lot of cash want to make. I'll stop there because I know that people will have other things to say about it.
But before we continue, I just wanted to, you brought up some data, and doing a little bit of research. World City, a Florida-based company that tracks trade patterns, uses census data. They're really up to date. And through July, according to World City, Mexico, two-way trade between Mexico and the United States was $352 billion. And obviously, Texas is the most affected. Number one port, Laredo, with $133 billion in two-way trade. A distant second, but still significant, is El Paso, which also includes New Mexico, $45 billion. And you also have the port at Far and Eagle Pass and the port of Houston. But again, Mexico overall is the number 3 trading partner. China is currently number 1 with $370 billion in two-way trade during that same time frame. Exports to China were $74 billion. Imports were $295 billion. So that's a deficit of about $220 billion. Going to Canada, through July, $362 billion in two-way trade between the United States and Mexico. For obvious reasons, none of the Texas ports are on the top 10 list. But according to the Canada-Texas Chamber of Commerce, which I didn't even know existed until we started talking about, this dynamic that's going on, Texas does about $4 billion in two-way trade with the Canadians.
So what are we doing having a trade with Canada?
Mr. Martin, I wanted to ask you, a lot has been said about the deficit. The administration always says there's a trade deficit. Some people think that that's overblown. It's kind of a red herring to sort of push the issue at the forefront, but it's not really that easy to say, well, we have a deficit, this is why we need to tweak trade policy. So if you could run down the deficits with these 3 major countries and how the reality about how that affects the U.S. economy.
Well, thank you. They say that it's about the trade deficit,
right,
but it's really not. I mean, that's baloney. This is about politics. And really what we're dealing with in trade in these discussions in all 3 cases of China, Mexico, and Canada is really a lack of leadership, and also the partisan divide we see on so many issues is impacting this issue. So if you look at the Chinese have just purchased a 4-page ad in the Des Moines Register. The Chinese government purchased a 4-page ad in the Chinese government to make their case to the voters in Iowa about trade and about that particular dispute with the president. If you go back a few years, the real beginning of this was a lack of substance. President Reagan was the first person that raised the issue of NAFTA. President Bush carried it on. President Clinton carried it on. You had in trade a real bipartisan approach to trade policy. Mrs. Clinton and Senator Clinton and Senator Obama both started out saying they were for NAFTA. But then along came 2008, and all of a sudden both of them decided they're against NAFTA.
Sure.
That was nothing about trade. That was pure domestic politics. Unfortunately, that's continued. When NAFTA was passed initially, the majority of the people that were supporting it, particularly elected officials, Tony, I think you'll remember, were Republicans. And there was a contingent in the Democratic Party with sincere objections, particularly on the part of labor, about what the impact of NAFTA would be. And you couldn't blame them at the time. Now that's reversed. In Texas, for example, when you look at NAFTA, 56% of the Democrats in Texas think NAFTA's been good, and only a quarter of the Republicans.
Okay.
Now, that's not a fault of either party. That's a fault of leadership. No one's told the story, really, about what's going on here. So when you look at China, when you look at Canada, and you look at Mexico, this so-called renegotiation of NAFTA has very little of the substance that was there in the original effort. We're going to say we did something about automobiles. We're going to take the percentage up from 65% to 72%. And you're going to be able to say, well, I did that for the automobile industry. They don't seem to have gotten that message. Ford Motor Company's lost $1 billion so far over these idiotic trade statements that have been made. And the other thing I think to really focus in on, a treaty like NAFTA requires congressional approval.
Sure.
A tariff does not require congressional approval. So what really concerns me about trade and about this whole discussion is that we're now setting trade policy by focus group. And until somebody stands up and takes issue with that in a bipartisan fashion, like was done on NAFTA, the 2 strongest advocates for NAFTA in the state of Texas were George Bush and Ann Richards. And she came first, he came second. He understood, Governor Bush understood Mexico better than any governor in Texas, I believe, with the possible exception of Sam Houston, who had a little different perspective on it. But I think that really the negotiators are doing the best they can. And the trade, sure, there's trade imbalances, but those, you don't solve trade imbalances, as Tony knows better than I do, by press release.
Right.
And you certainly don't do it by bluster and by threats. And it's gone on both parties. It's the extreme of each party is what's gotten us to this point.
Yeah. If I could go on with the political theme here, Ambassador, this one's for you. Obviously, a few months ago, people assumed that Mr. López Obrador would be likely just looking at the polls, but now it's confirmed. How does that affect how the U.S. and Mexico move forward in the next few months? Obviously, the incoming president has some influence. He was influential for the Peña Nieto administration rejecting certain money that the United States wanted to give Mexico to help deport Central Americans. So there is definitely some influence there. Yeah. So with respect to NAFTA or any trade deal, how does that go?
Yeah. Without going too far afield on this, but I really want to just make a sort of comment on Jack's point, because ultimately it is absolutely the critical element that is missing, and that's leadership, particularly on issues of trade, or really when you think of any of the bigger issues of the day, that where it is something that is, from this perspective of mine, and I realize being a pro-trade person is somewhat subjective, but where there is a greater good that is hard to understand, hard to quantify, that's when leadership is most important. Because the fact is that we're in an environment where if you have lost your job, you're a very real advocate for something. You have felt it personally, and if you can relate it to trade on some, you're going to be very loud, and that gets to the politics that Jack is talking about. Impacted constituencies feel this is very real. Benefited constituencies see this as less abstract and may not feel it as strongly. And so that's where leadership comes in, about talking about the benefits of these sorts of things. The second point I would make about trade is that we have lost sight of the fact that trade is not only, it's not solely a transactional thing. For the United States, it's very much a role in the world sort of thing. And our deciding, this administration's decision to remove ourselves from TPP was a very clear statement to the rest of the world that we had essentially conceded large parts of a region to China. And I think China is playing a much longer game in terms of positioning themselves than we are currently doing. And so that's the second point I would make. The third, and it will come right back to your question about President-elect López Obrador, he in some sense is not too unlike the presidencies that you have seen, or the electoral movements you have seen in other parts of the world, whether it's the Brexit movement, what we saw recently in Italy, what we saw in the United States, and an extension of something that says, you know what, the establishment isn't working for us. And López Obrador basically ran on a campaign that said the established parties in this country did nothing to really address your concerns about corruption in government, public corruption, and insecurity on the streets. Mm-hmm. And so essentially, I think Mexico is saying we want more accountability from our leadership. And López Obrador positioned himself as the one individual that could do that. And so I know your question, probably the implicit there was, is a man of the left, right, quote unquote, going to impact the nature of the relationship with the United States? And I have to say that if you look at the current administration in Mexico, they did everything they could to try to position themselves as a friendly government. I mean, inviting then candidate Trump to Mexico during the campaign was a hugely controversial decision in Mexico. And yet they felt that perhaps this would buy some positioning with his campaign. I think what we have seen is this administration tends to be much harder on its allies in many respects. I mean, a national security interest tariff on Canada, or the comments at NATO, or the recent criticism of Merkel or May, given their political challenges, and yet at the same time, seemingly a regard for Erdogan or Ban or Putin in Russia. And so I'm not sure how it's going to impact. Stylistically, you would have to say that the President-elect López Obrador has the trappings of a brighter line sort of president. And so that may be good. The transition has suggested that he's pretty temperate on the market issues and issues of NAFTA and the way they've aligned themselves on the negotiation. So I'd have to say, you know, right now, all things considered, I'm pretty encouraged that this new administration is doing the right things. I'm a little concerned, more than a little actually, that our own administration has lost sight of all the chess pieces on the board that they have, where they have created kind of a bit of chaos in terms of a lot of our trade relationships and our geopolitical ones. How do you put all the pieces back in the right place at a time when I think China and Russia and North Korea and Iran have very clear senses that we're still the country that they would like to see most disrupted?
Ambassador, I'm gonna switch now to what we spend our money on every single day and how that could be affected. The chairman was good enough to go to the, in my opinion, the best border city in the United States, in El Paso, a few months ago, and had an
no, that's Brownsville. I'm sorry.
Well, okay. Well, we're gonna have to arm wrestle out this panel, yeah. But it was an interim committee hearing, obviously well suited to be in El Paso, the second busiest inland port. And, you know, after 2 or 3 hours of testimony, people start looking at their watches and they start, okay, you know, I'm hungry, you know what's going to happen. And all of a sudden, a gentleman from the Beer Institute goes up to the podium and everybody just stops and listens. They're like, okay, what's going on here? And he brought up a point saying, you know, depending on which way trade goes, you're going to spend more money for a 6-pack of, you know, nice beer, crappy light beer that I drink, you know, a bottle of wine or whatever. So what is the public at large missing? A lot has been said on steel, on energy, on automotive parts, but what are the smaller things that people buy every single day that are going to be affected one way or another, depending on what happens with the incoming trade deals?
So the ambassador said it right. I mean, the pain of trade is felt acutely when people lose their jobs. The benefits of trade are socialized throughout the entire community, and that's why it makes it sometimes difficult to make it tangible for people. If we have a trade war that involves aluminum tariffs, your beer's going to go up, the cans, right? If we have a trade war that involves U.S. ag, your beer's going to go up because of the component parts, the agricultural products that go into your beer. If we have a trade war that involves steel and aluminum, it's going to be more expensive to buy a car. The automotive industry has projected that for a compact car, the price would go up between it's $1,500 to $3,000. For a mid-priced car, it's going to go up from $3,000 to $5,000, and for an expensive car, you're looking at north of $5,000. Those are real tangible results. And putting $5,000 on a new car, I was meeting with an auto manufacturer this morning, that means less cars are sold, right? So the automotive manufacturers folks saying, hey, if we're in a full-scale trade war that includes tariffs on steel and aluminum, you're going to sell 2 million less cars in the United States. When you sell 2 million less cars in the United States, you lose 700,000 jobs, right? In Texas, we have 400,000 jobs alone that benefit, that are created by the trilateral trade that NAFTA has generated in the 25-year rules-based trading relationship that we're in. So in the end, it's your beer's going to cost more, and you may lose your job, right? I mean, that's how tangible it is.
With respect to the current agreement to NAFTA, Mr. Martin, when NAFTA went into effect, there were protests all over Mexico on the anniversary. There's still some protests on the bridge, on the international bridges here. A lot of people say that, you know, farmers, the indigenous folks in Mexico, got a pretty raw deal, and some folks on both sides of the Rio Grande, they want to see more advocacy for the working people of Mexico. How does that play into the current negotiations, or is it going to be, you know, second verse same as the first with respect to the indigenous folks and the really sort of lower rung workers in Mexico?
Well, there were legitimate concerns in Mexico when NAFTA was first discussed, both in Mexico and in the U.S. And there were a lot of people that had a valid point about what would happen. Interestingly, to my point about this agreement, Raleigh not being about the substance of trade, the agriculture sector is left largely untouched in this agreement. So as far as Mexico or the U.S., there's also a provision in there that stipulates that wages in Mexico have to go up. So I would make a case that in a thoughtful discussion and negotiation about NAFTA, both parties ought to be able to prevail. But this is not a thoughtful discussion about anything. This is a political stunt that is a follow-on to the wall and to immigration, and I believe at its root is racism. And it's an attempt to build a greater emotion within a small group of people in a particular party by one individual. And I think the tragedy of that is when you look at the rest of the region, we have 12 offices all over Latin America, and every one of them, you know what they're thinking about now? What happens next? As Tony will remember, when NAFTA was done, there were trade agreements all over Latin America. And every one of those countries now that's talking about trade and investments and foreign capital coming in, they're scared to death because of their business and trade depends on predictability. And it depends on something that you can count on for a number of years as policy. And what's going on right now gives no one that assurance. And let's don't kid ourselves, this is not about trade.
Mr. Anchia, last year it was the same issue with the protections for folks in Mexico, and you and some other folks, mainly from the Dallas Fed, said, you know, there's certain statistics that say that poor people in Mexico got it even worse, but overall you were under the assumption that NAFTA, or actually you had the knowledge and the facts that NAFTA actually improved wages overall. Is that still the position going into these new deals?
It is, but it only applies if you look at it in the aggregate, right? And are there winners and losers in trade? No question, right? It happens. When the market moves, sometimes you have people who are dislocated, who lose their jobs. The solution to that is to help those people. Worker Retraining, Trade Adjustment and Assistance Act in the United States, that I think where we fell down on post-NAFTA is not providing a robust worker retraining program for people who were dislocated as a result of trade, as a result of the elimination of tariffs and duties and non-tariff barriers. That was the real crime, because those funds, while they started out being funded well, over time were chipped at, and then effectively underfunded. And I think that's where you got a lot of resentment. But on the aggregate, wages have gone up, way more jobs have been created than lost. Wages in Mexico have gone up, especially on the border, where you have the just-in-time assembly and a lot of those hardened supply chains. But Mexico, I think, had a responsibility to its indigenous populations to get them relief that they needed as a result of the dislocation that would happen in trade. The U.S. had the same, and Canada, ironically, did the best job of that for its citizens.
Mr. Ambassador, if I could follow up with something Mr. Martin said the previous question with respect to national security and immigration and things like that. Is it possible? I'm sure you all know that Mexico and the United States have a staring contest about guns going south and drugs flowing north and cash and stuff like that. Is it possible that any trade agreement, any bill could turn into an omnibus bill that includes other facets with respect to national sovereignty, national security, immigration, or anything like that? Or is this just a business deal? I'm just speaking from a Texas-led standpoint, where you get one bill that seems very narrow and all of a sudden it turns into what people call a Christmas tree.
Well, I mean, is it possible? Sure. Is it likely? No. Okay. And I'll tell you why. Even in the original NAFTA, there was a desire at that time to include issues like energy and immigration. And in Mexico, energy was then sort of this rail that could not be touched for fear of jeopardizing the entire agreement. And in the U.S., the sentiment was similar on immigration. Now, if you asked somebody like me about these sorts of things, I would say, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about the flow of capital and define capital broadly, it's both the capacity to invest and move your human capital to the highest and best sort of application of it, right? But that's not the way these trade agreements are negotiated. And so you're really in a much more hypercharged political environment. And so to the extent that you can get an agreement at all, I think is going to be generally positive. What was encouraging, I think, from the standpoint of all these other things that are impacted the beer, and I met more Iowa and Idaho farmers in Mexico that were selling grain and hops, hops and barley, I guess. I know a little bit about beer, but not a lot. And so it was sort of interesting, but you're not going to have this sort of broad thing. Now, but here's a byproduct of it. When you're not really, when you're negotiating the way we are, you're burning capital in terms of a relationship that is very important to have on all the other aspects of your bilateral. All what I call the transnationals, whether it's transnational security, transnational movements of people, the human trafficking, the transnational cartels. The terrorism. There's another aspect to your relationship that suffers when you are burning that goodwill and trust equity the way we've done throughout this negotiating period. So directly, not likely, but indirectly, when you look at the relationship in a larger sense, yeah, I think there's actually been costs that we don't appreciate associated with this style of negotiation.
I want to ask a question about infrastructure at the ports of entry. This is one issue where, for example, a few years back, Congressman O'Rourke and Senator Cornyn, stood side by side at the International Bridge in El Paso, touting a public-private partnership to try to decrease wait times, to try to staff up at CBP, and a lot of people, it's been said for years and years and years, let's try to facilitate legal trade and legal immigration. But it seems like year after year, they fall short on funding improvements for the international bridges, CBP officers, even agriculture inspectors who are very, very specifically trained to make sure that a boll weevil doesn't get smuggled in, and have a devastating effect. So where are we on funding for infrastructure, or has that sort of fallen by the wayside because it's now, it's border enforcement, but not in the way that would facilitate trade?
I really don't follow that.
Well, I'll say, first of all, when Tony was county judge in Cameron County, he dealt with the infrastructure issue every day in the International Bridge and really led on the border in terms of raising their hands and saying we have to have some help on these issues. I doubt seriously that you'll see Cornyn and Cruz having any more press conferences for the time being about anything, particularly this. So that bill, my hunch is, we'll be dealing with that next year. There's no question, given the trade and the economic, if you just go along the border, the economic explosion that's going on the Texas side of the border, and I assume on the Mexico side of the border, requires a great deal of infrastructure. But I'd just like to see maybe half the money from the wall diverted to bridges, or something that actually benefited people in terms of commerce or improving their lives every day, instead of this crazy idea of building a wall. If we're not careful, that if we keep this up with this rhetoric against Mexico and all of Latin America, we're going to look up one day and that wall is going to have the unintended consequence of meaning nobody here wants to go over there, and vice versa. Nobody's going to want to change trade or ideas if this rhetoric of this wall comes up. In effect, you're going to put a wall up at a port because you're going to cut back on trade.
Sure. No, I mean, a week ago they started building El Paso.
I want to just, Jack was kind enough to remind me that I was a county judge 30-some-odd years ago.
That's when we first met.
Yeah. But my concern about the border has always been larger than infrastructure. And I used to tongue-in-cheekly play on that old Mexican saying about, poor Mexico, what is it, so far from God, so close to the United States or something. And mine was, what a wonderful place I lived on the border. Our problem was that we were so close to God and so far from Washington and Ciudad de Mexico. And so in a sense, we were always playing catch up in terms of not just infrastructure, what I called overall capacity. Because in the wake of sort of the early Maquila and then NAFTA and the development and the growth, you saw growth in the area, and we've always been playing catch up in terms of capacity, whether it be the infrastructure Bridges, which actually has pretty good advocacy. I mean, they're trade people that are very concentrated on infrastructure, and we're still playing catch up. But the broader questions of capacity, whether it be water, education, roads, not just roads and bridges as relate to ports, but we've always been playing catch up along the border. And I think it's because, unfortunately, I think that both the state of Texas and the northeastern states, they see the border as something very critical, but they don't quite see it as a funding priority.
Okay.
And I think it's not just the bridges,
Right.
it's more broadly the infrastructure you need to have very, very competitive, whether it's manufacturing or logistics, those sort of hubs that each of those border communities could be.
Right. And Chairman, just for example, on Memorial Day, this past Memorial Day, I went to Juarez for work, and I was coming back. It's not a holiday in Mexico, so there's traffic as normal, but it took me 2.5 hours to come back at the Free Bridge, coming through the Bridge of the Americas, because CBP, I'm assuming, didn't want to pay the time and a half, double time, so they had 4 lanes open, literally 2.5 hours. Last week I went, and it took me 5 minutes to come back. Yeah. So it seems like it's really, you're just kind of closing your eyes and throwing at a dartboard blind as far as how long you're going to wait. So how you hear it all the time, being the chairman of the commission or the committee. So how do you improve that?
And we've had border wait times hearings in El Paso, in FAR. Sure. We visited bridges in Brownsville. I mean, up and down the border.
And to give credit to the municipal governments, they do a good job about having cameras and letting people know what the wait times are, but it doesn't seem like it's enough.
2 data points. The first one is, for every minute that northbound traffic to the United States, bilateral trade, sure, northbound truck traffic, is idling at the border, it costs the U.S. economy $116 million for every minute, okay? Second data point, we have militarized the border, right? Instead of making the border much more flexible. And we've militarized the border at a time when unauthorized immigration is at its lowest levels since 1970, right? In fact, the Baker Institute, so not some left-leaning organization, right? This is the James Baker Institute at Rice University, did a study that said that unauthorized crossings at the Texas U.S. border are 0.2% of all crossings. So you think about how many unauthorized crossings do you think there are in a given year? This is 2015 data at the U.S.-Mexico border. And this data was taken at the height of the unaccompanied minors crisis in 2015, about 250,000. Guess how many authorized crossings are at the Texas-Mexico border? 82,500,000 every year. So we are throwing all these resources at 0.2% of the problem. Now, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't control our borders, but what if we took half of the money for the wall? What if we invested in making the border more flexible so we can get people and trade and goods and services across the border? It'd be a huge benefit. And the last comment I'll make is that when we often talk about the Texas miracle, we talk about oil and gas, we talk about, I don't know, some people talk about right to work state, business-friendly laws. You know what the real reason is that we have a Texas miracle? It's 2 things. It's our proximity to Mexico, right? Our #1 trading partner. And 2, the fantastic immigrant labor force that we have in this state that is building the buildings, that is cleaning our homes, that is mowing the lawns, that is building our homes. It is that blood, that immigrant hunger and that blood that fills the veins of the Texas workforce every year. And imagine the benefit, the economic benefit that we would get if we allowed more legal immigration into our state, so we had this workforce that would come out of the shadows and even be more productive than it is now. That's the Texas miracle that nobody wants to talk about on the other side of the aisle.
Folks,
on the border, I'd like to just mention one other thing real briefly, since I don't get the chance to do this very often. We have a real problem on the Texas border on our side of the have and have not problem. We talk a lot about economic explosion, a lot of economic boom. Used to, it was called the colonias. There's a lot of people getting left behind, and they're not benefiting from this. And when we're talking about it, devoting all these resources to bridges and walls and that sort of thing, I believe that the state and federal government has a responsibility also to make sure those people benefit from the border. When you go down there and you see that, it's dramatic in terms of the people that are getting left out of this economic boom. And I think we just have as much responsibility to that as we do to build a new bridge.
But and that could also trickle down to the state level, because you have bills filed every single session to sort of stop the unscrupulous, the developers that, that they can't, these folks in the colonials can't get, house to water line connections, but it's, for some reason or another, they always seem to sort of die in committee or on the House floor. So, folks, I'm going to ask one more question, but if you guys want to start lining up, if you have any questions yourself, I'm going to talk about China real quick, but feel free to line up and ask a question for our panelists. Just the last thing, there's been a lot of news lately about China, and again, obviously it's not as near and dear to our hearts as Mexico is, but it's very significant because of just the amount of trade that the country does. I think Reuters reported just recently, after the administration hinted that it would be China meddling in the elections and not Russia. Obviously, there's some sore feelings there, but Reuters reported there would be unspecified policy actions in the coming weeks against China. How does all this political play with China specifically play into the trade issue?
Well, I'm really happy to see that, we are punishing China by imposing tariffs on Europe and Canada and Mexico. I mean, I think that's a really cogent strategy. If China is the violator, we're instead castigating our transatlantic allies and our North American partners. It doesn't make any sense. I'm glad that now the administration is turning its attention to China. I wish they would have allowed us to project our power through the Trans-Pacific Partnership to Asia, along with our Trans-Pacific allies, to take the fight to China in that market, as opposed to retreating and ceding that global position.
Mr. Ambassador, nothing to add?
No, I think Rafael said it very well. I mean, it's very likely that by the end of the year we may be facing, between the tariffs that have been already imposed and those that are being talked about as relates to China, and then you throw in the automotive, and you already have the steel, that we may be facing tariffs on 40 to 50% of those goods that we're importing into this country. And I didn't see the rest of the shirt, but I mean, there's no way to look at a tariff as other than a tax. And it tends to be a very regressive one because it impacts goods that all of us need. And I don't think that this administration has quite made that connection, that a tariff is a tax, and it's a tax on a consumer, and it's a broad-based regressive one. And
other countries don't pay that tax, right? Who pays that tax?
We pay
Americans.
that tax. Yeah, exactly. It's a tax on Americans. And so I just don't. I don't get this. The other thing is that China is the second largest economy in the world, with a historic and tremendous capacity for discipline and playing the long game. Right. So I think that this is something that if we really get into it, we may be feeling pain for an extended period of time. And I'm not sure what the impact on our economy might be. We're at the end of a very long run. We really are. And we are also at the end of any capacity to deal with a downturn through monetary or fiscal policy because of the extraordinary debt that governments have taken on around the world and the loose money that we've seen. You throw in trade headwinds and a trade war, and I really think that we may be walking ourselves into a very precarious period. It really does concern me. And at a time when we are kind of stepping back from our role in the world, and again, I think Russia and China is an economic, Russia playing their sort of geostrategic game, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan. I mean, this is a country that we don't think about often, but we should. I mean, 5th largest military, 6th largest nuclear arsenal. These are things that really ought to concern us. And I don't see us building up the kind of defenses to the sort of cyber vulnerabilities that we feel that exist as a country. So there's a lot going on there. We talk about trade, but we are opening up so many, I think, areas of vulnerability for this country that we don't really appreciate, and that this administration doesn't seem to have a very strategic approach to. So anyway,
well, so I spend a lot of time in China. We have a significant part of Hill and Knowlton's business is there. We got the first license in 1984 of a communications firm to operate there. Tony's right. They're very patient. To them, this is a long game. Mm-hmm. And they view all of this right now as just noise. There may be some retaliatory back and forth on their part, but they're smarter than that. And so I think what you're going to see is the economic impact of this is going to begin to be felt here. Car companies, people doing business with China, they opened up their economy to trade with the West. And now what's happening is we're about to look up and they're going to be trading with everybody but us in terms of their investments they're making, the partnerships they're making. It's not a perfect situation in China, but it is a road we've gone down already in terms of our investment of capital and investment of people there. And so they're going to wait this out. And I'll tell you one other thing real quick. If we think we're going to make a deal in North Korea while we're engaged in this trade war with China, that's nuts. We'll never get a deal done in North Korea until we solve the China issue.
And I don't want to assume anything, but I would guess that if Jack and I sat down and visited, we'd say, yeah, there's some challenges from dealing in China, intellectual property and trademarks and these sorts of things, their currency, and there's things that we got to be talking to them about and drawing very clear lines. I just don't think that we've approached that with any real strategy in mind. We just sort of approached it kind of the way you might, bluster with a kid next door about who gets to bat first. As opposed to really think this through, recognizing what the stakes are.
I'll stop you right there and open up to questions. Yes, sir.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Is there anything that you think the Texas legislature might be able to do bipartisan to help against this, or even
Right
is there
down
anything
there.
do you hear?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, no. Second part of the question in Congress. I mean, right now there's no groundswell for the Republican majority to try to go against anything that Donald Trump is doing, but maybe there's something you hear in the background that they're waiting for it to be just that much worse to come up with some legislative prohibitions or attacks on that.
Yeah, excellent question.
Any help there?
The delta between the federal and state government on this issue.
So in the state government, regrettably, I tried to get a resolution, supporting NAFTA done, a letter to the administration saying do no harm. I want to say we had 56 Democrats sign on to it, 3 Republicans here in the Texas legislature. They're scared to death of the administration. They don't want to cross Donald Trump. And so on an issue that 20 years ago would have been right down the fairway, those aren't the folks that we have in the legislature anymore. Even if they ideologically would be on board, they're very, very reticent to do anything. So ironically, when you look at the polling on NAFTA, Latinos in Texas are among the highest supporters of the agreement because they've seen a lot of the economic activity increase along the border area over the 25 years of the rules-based trading relationship that we've been in. It's other groups that have sort of fallen off in terms of support.
Yeah.
So a lot of people who signed that letter that said do no harm were Latino legislators.
Yeah. Thank you for your question, sir. Yes, sir. Ma'am? Thank you for...
So my father's been in the construction industry for over 20 years now, and with Texas growing so much, obviously business has been booming. And I see that an issue in the construction industry is wanting to hire legal workers, but the issue is there's not enough. So a lot of construction companies feel like it's their hands forced to hire illegal immigrants. Is there a solution already in the making for that for construction companies?
Yeah, it's super easy, right? You create a safe and legal system where you match willing workers and willing employers on a transnational basis, right? I mean, it's that simple. When the economy's white hot and you can't find workers in a particular industry, you have an immigration policy that opens the spigot so that you have fantastic human capital that flows into that industry and gets the job done, right? Currently, we have a system that is artificially contracted, that creates perverse outcomes like women getting raped trying to go across the border, people dying in the desert, drowning in a river, right? And then people terrorized here when you actually have that match of willing workers with willing employers, you have illegal companies and unauthorized workers, right? And to me, it's the most clear thing that you would meet supply and demand on a transnational basis in a safe and legal way. We can't do it because there's no political will to do it.
Very excellent question. Thank you so much. And we've written extensively about the so-called loopholes in hiring and independent contractors versus I-9 employees.
Wage theft.
All sorts of things. And as red as the Texas legislature is, the E-Verify laws that are passed at the state level are very, very lukewarm, to put it in a nice way, because there aren't
underwhelming.
A lot of they are required for state agencies. I don't assume that somebody that's in the country without authorization is going to apply for a job at a state agency. Sir.
Thank you. The term trade war has been batted around quite a bit in this panel. There's an element of a war in trade that I'd like to know your gentlemen's thoughts on with respect to the drug trade. The Brookings Institute this year published a paper which estimates that in the period 2007 to 2017, 177,000 Mexicans have lost their lives to the cartels. During the same period, the National Institute of Health estimates that the number of deaths of Americans to cocaine is 65,000. And finally, the Organization of North American States has published a paper that estimates that the cocaine traffic between Mexico and the United States is about $34 billion a year. Those are big numbers and lots of blood. How does that factor in to all of the overall economic trade negotiation?
This kind of goes back to the security and if anything's going to be bundled into a trade bill. Anybody want to weigh in?
So, look, I'll just offer a couple of thoughts, because we've had hearings on this in the Texas legislature, because trade also includes both legal trade and unauthorized trade, right? Unauthorized trade in human beings, unauthorized trade in guns, unauthorized trade in illicit drugs across the border. And each of those things are impacted by national policy, and national policy that has not operated on a binational basis or a trinational basis, but independently, right? So U.S. drug policy has a direct impact on Mexican people dying in Mexico, right? Because the cycle's like this. U.S. demand allows for Mexican drugs to come up north. Those Mexican drugs provide money and guns back down south. Those money and guns are used to terrorize and kill Mexican population and bribe elected officials in Mexico and the United States. And then it is a loop, right? And it is, I think, it makes a lot of sense for us to revisit our domestic policy on drugs and guns to make sure that we don't get these perverse results. Because right now, our incentives are in the wrong place.
They have a gentleman up here. He's been very patient. I'm sorry. It's the last. We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Very quickly. Excellent panel. Thank you. You cited the statistic that every 1 minute costs the U.S. $119 million. I quickly tried to Google that and couldn't come up with it. Could you elaborate on that and perhaps provide where that comes from?
Absolutely. I'll get you the site on it afterwards, but it is a statistic that we have in our hearings heard over and over and over again. And look at the Border Trade Alliance, and I don't think it's 119, it's maybe 112, but in that ballpark. I gave you what's called a swag method, so it's scientific wild ass guess. All right.
Thank you. And lastly, to follow up on that point about the trucks that are idling at the bridge, there's also environmental concerns. When you have trucks that are sitting there, spewing their you can't turn off a semi once it's been going, right? You can't get it started again, so they're just sitting there, and the exhaust and everything is going up. So we could spend several hours, but I thank you all for at least being here for at least this 1 hour on this very important panel. So thank you very much.
Good job.